This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
And we have an hour for this session, which will be looking at issues of more long-term management of mining and the end of mining finance. We'll be beginning with Caroline Digby, who is Director of the Coast Mining Alliance and the Eden Project. She was previously Programme Director of the International Council on Mining and Metals, and before that spent more or less Research Director for a project on UBC at the International Institute for Environmental Development. Her presentation will be followed by that of Rosemary Thorpe, who is Emeritus Reader of Economics in Latin America and Fellow Emeritus at St Antony's College in Oxford, University where she spent her academic life. She was also Chair of Oxfam DB not too long ago and has written extensively on the economic history and present-day economic development of Latin America with a strong relation towards Europe. We'll begin with, each of the speakers will speak for about 15 minutes and then we'll have an answer question session. We'll begin with Caroline Digby, who will be speaking about local development at the end of a project's life cycle.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to talk a little bit about mine closure and mine closure planning because that's what we imagine to be the end of the project life cycle. I think the focus, I probably have more questions than answers today because I'm going to talk about what the current situation is around mine closure and mine closure planning, why it's like that, and what needs to change to make it a more successful outcome and a better long-term legacy for the mining sector. Why am I here? Well, in fact, I went to Eden to use the Eden Project as a story of the art of the possible in mining legacy. This is the Videlva pit in 1998, and this is how it looks on a nice sunny day today. We now have over 1 million visitors a year. We employ more than 500 people. And our economic impact is estimated conservatively at about over £1 million a year to the local economy, with the largest rainforest in captivity. And primarily Eden is a symbol or an exemplar of the art of the possible, showing what can be done when people put their mind to it with old mine sites. The title for my talk was about development at the end of the life cycle, and I thought this would be quite useful to focus our attention on how recently the mining sector has considered post-closure as part of the cycle. If you look at the yellow boxes, which basically take you from exploration to operation, that was what the mining industry considered to be the life cycle until quite recently. In the 70s and 80s, 90s, they started to think about, we better do something about closure itself because we need an exit license, and so we better think about how we're going to get that exit license. But it's really only in the last decade that mining industry and mining sector has begun to realize the legacy that may continue in perpetuity of their current day operations. And as you can imagine, they haven't done a huge amount about this, given that they've only been working on it for the last 10 years. Oops, my slides have gone slightly funny. Sorry. I think different computer systems mean that half the pictures aren't showing up. let me talk you through it rather than worry about pictures. It's not over when it's over. Today's industry talks about integrated mine closure planning. What they mean by that is they want to look at not just the financial and environmental costs of closure, but they want to incorporate what the social or socioeconomic impacts of closure might be on the local community. There's not very much in the way of guidance available. The International Council on Mining and Metals has a small toolkit that can sort of help you if you're an engineer in a mining production department. But there's really very little guidance in how to prepare communities for the fact that companies are no longer going to be in that economy, in that community. Companies need to be very clear about the objectives, understanding their liabilities and risks when they pull out. They say they want to focus on leaving communities better off when they pull out. But what does this mean? Because in order to achieve leaving communities better off when they leave, they need to define some desired end-of-life criteria for those communities, and very little work has been done on this. But I think the main point to make is that with closure planning, unless the mine company is actually embedding the closure planning in its sustainability planning, it's very unlikely to be successful. Because if they leave it till it's only 10 years to closure or 5 years to closure or whatever, it is probably too late to deal with the kind of issues that they will be facing with the community that is facing closure. I think you've probably heard this morning a lot about how social license to operate has not been secured and the various reasons why that is. But you can imagine that if a community and a company relationships are tense around operation when there are benefits to be shared, and the arguments about how those benefits are shared, you can imagine that the tension rises significantly when those benefits are no longer going to be there. And so companies are even more tentative and reluctant to talk about closure and to share information than they are to talk about when they're in full operation, which makes for a real problem. Key to the issue of understanding why closure planning is difficult is around the asymmetry of power. And particularly when you look at some of the Latin American countries, you have very obvious asymmetry between the rich, knowledgeable companies with all the resources and the impacted communities often serviced by poor governance. But actually, even if we look within the companies who are supposed to have all the power and all the cards, when it comes to closure planning, there are a huge number of reasons why they are suffering from not being able to deliver planning properly. Some of them take a compliance approach. Compliance has not caught up with this change in thinking about leaving a legacy, a socioeconomic legacy. Very often companies, when they get towards the end of their operations, have a lack of internal capacity. In many of these locations, you've got managers who are coming in and out every 3 years on a 3-year cycle, and you're not going to find the people with the innovation and the really forward thinking and leadership skills that you want when a mine is coming towards the end of its life. So you have issues around lack of corporate memory, lack of continuity, lack of a common vision, even internally within the company. They don't have the baselines from where, when the mine started. Their mindset is around that this is a dead asset rather than thinking about how to turn liabilities into community assets. And I think one of the key things is, even where a good sustainability plan has been in place and there has been good work with the local community around economic development, particularly in supply chain, very often the sustainability of those supply chain initiatives is not addressed to look at what happens when the mining operations cease. One of the key things about getting the closure planning working better, I think, is emphasised by, more than ever when you come to talking about closure, the company has to cede control to the communities and the local authorities, because they're the ones who aren't going to be there. But companies are very unused to ceding control. We heard this morning about the dialogue tables and that process and how it has worked. But largely, when it comes to talking about the site itself closing and what the assets will be dispatched for, companies go back into communication mode. They are not really looking for the participation of the other players in trying to figure out what can be done with the assets when the mine closes. The key aspect of this, I think, is to make a strong link between the sustainability plan that the company has with the local economy and the local community, local authority, to its closure plan. It may seem obvious to all of you, but actually many existing mines have had to retrofit closure plans in. So when we talk about starting or designing for closure, which is what companies will say about the future, but in fact most mines that are in operation today have had to have the closure plan put in retrospectively. So all the ideas about designing for closure and having assets and land use and facilities that will be ready for alternative uses has never happened in the planning process. And you are trying to decide about a temporary use of a bunch of assets that is going to have to be converted into something else. But unlike the example we saw from Peru this morning, there was no discussion at the beginning about the design for after use. I'm sorry about the photos. One of the reasons why I think closure plans and companies founder in trying to implement the closure plans is because the local government's roles and responsibilities are very unclear. And in particular, we find in virtually any country where I've looked specifically at a mine closing, is there is within the regulator a significant lack of technical training or experience on closure. Very limited time to review closure plans, very limited updating of closure plans as things happen, very specifically lack of quality control on the review process. Quite often you will see environmental and social impact assessments that are cut and paste from one place to another. Local authorities have very little ability to even understand how generic some of these impacts have been. And so one of the recommendations that I think needs to happen if longer term development is going to be successful for after mining and life after mining is that we need to set up some sort of support facilities for local authorities that will allow them to manage the transition of assets, of infrastructure, of resources, that will allow it to work with the community to understand what the land use planning will be post-mining. I'm sorry, the photos seem to have gone down here. For a long time we've talked about, when talking about mine closure planning, as we need to design for closure right from the beginning, taking the mine to be ready for its after use. But actually, I think we need to come up with stronger language that says we're going to design mines backwards, and we're going to start with what it's going to look like after the resource has been extracted and work backwards through the mine plan. Because I think at the moment we have absolutely no the companies are planning maybe 10 years ahead, but are still unwilling or unable to discuss with the rest of the local stakeholders what will happen when the mine closes. And this last slide is a copy of a book we've recently published called 101 Things to Do with Hole in the Ground, which we have translated into Spanish and brings examples from all over the world about what after uses have happened in mines from Germany to Australia to Chile to Mexico to North America, all across Europe. What's interesting is we did this book as a very light touch coffee table book about mine closure and successful post-mining regeneration. And because there is so little about stories of successful afterlife, it has been really successful. And one of the things that we are doing in the coming years is taking some of this sort of coffee book approach to photos of successful post-uses and drilling down to understand what made those places successful. But by and large, what we found so far is that the mining industry has been on the back foot, and it has actually been outsiders and people from outside the sector who come in with a post-mining vision that have been able to transform stuff. And so we, as stakeholders in the mining industry, really need to start pushing the companies to understand that they need to look at the vision for the future and not have an interim period of 50 or 60 years before this transformation actually happens, when often when the liabilities have transferred to the government authorities because the mining company has long since gone. Thank you. I'm sorry about the photos.